On Monday the 8th of April 2024, I was invited into the BBC Essex studios in Chelmsford. Thank you, Aquila Rodriguez, and thank you, BBC Essex, for having me in. I look forward to speaking to you soon.
Now, as I've mentioned, a lot of us will have links to the forces here in the county, whether that's the armed forces, the police, or sometimes even both. And our next guest has started a podcast to try and capture the stories of those in post-service life all over the world after serving 3 decades at Essex Police. Former officer Paul Mulleary hosts the Job Downloaded podcast, speaking to guests about serving as a special, being a police artist, or people's experiences being thrusted into service on the battlefield. In fact, here's a clip from an episode with Dr. Bob Sherwood, who grew up on the police force in Chingford and then ended up studying a new degree to become a Holocaust historian.
And I started at university in 2012, September, Holocaust Studies, and it worked. It did work. It clicked, and I got a merit for my master's degree and a distinction for my dissertation, which I did comparing the United Kingdom war crimes team at the end of the war, Nuremberg and all that, to the American teams, because I went to the States twice. I went to the museums out there. My wife found a museum for me where a guy there had been part of a special unit in America, which no one in England had ever heard of. And that is worth a lot to a historian because you find out new things.
A clip from one of the latest episodes there. And Paul is joining us here in the studio to chat about these episodes and more, of course. Welcome, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me in today.
No, thank you for being here. I mean, this is quite the concept. What's your biggest motivation for putting this podcast together?
Well, I call it "What did you do in the war, Grandad" moment, because I didn't actually ask my grandparents what they did during the Second World War, which is a massive mistake because they're no longer here to ask those questions. So I had this idea that I was going to start interviewing these great people, and it's gone from there. And I've had a bit of encouragement with some friends. And interestingly enough, I saw Bob at the Imperial War Museum, where he takes people round. And I took Rob Rinder's mum there. And it was Rob Rinder that actually got me into, or told me just to get on with it, because I'd been prevaricating for so long.
Just to go on, crack on, get this podcast done. And
yeah.
That's amazing. So you've had a lot of support from friends and people that you've known during your time in the police force.
Well, massively. And I've been a networker all of my life, really. And you have to call upon your friends in order to get these things off the ground. So I've got beefeaters on there. Andy Merry, who's a beefeater at the Tower of London, he's got multiple sclerosis now. He climbed Mont Blanc. These people have done amazing things, but they're my friends. And I took part in a television series with Rob Rinder. And I told him about this idea that I had. And he said, look, mate, just get on with it. Because whilst you're talking about it, you're not actually doing it. And that's how it all started.
So literally getting people, finding their stories and letting them share what they've been through with yourself and your audience, which is amazing. I mean, how hard is it to describe life post-service?
It's quite difficult because when you leave the police in particular, for me, it was like a bereavement. They took away my warrant card and all the things that and the teams that I'd been working with. And it was quite hard to adjust in a lot of ways. But it's what you do with your time afterwards and how you motivate yourself to get on with things. And most of my friends are doing something. I've got a mate who's a former chief superintendent who now runs a pizza business, and he does a mobile pizza oven. So everybody's got something to do. My brother, he runs a windsurfing company, down on the coast. So, but it is difficult. And I've always been into photography and filming, and that's me, and that's what I do. So I had all the gear, I had the ideas, and I just put it all together.
Which is always a very, very good place to start. I'm sorry, I was listening to you explain what various different careers people have gone into, and I was just wondering, when we listen to the podcast, is there anything that will really surprise us that someone's gone into after serving?
I think that Bob's quite an interest, the fact that he's gone down the route of the Holocaust historian, but they've all got a story. As an example, Faye Hepworth, she is a local resident. She lives in Hatfield Peveril. And in 1964, she was the personal assistant to Mountbatten. She was in the Royal Navy. And she was his personal assistant for well over a year. She travelled the world with him. She took the notes. She did everything. She flew around the world with Mountbatten, one of the most iconic military leaders this country's ever had. And they live on our doorstep. But we miss these stories because we don't ask the questions.
Wow. I mean, this is just where we're starting. We're going to continue having a chat with Paul Mullery here, host of the X Job Downloaded podcast. And as you've already heard, just from these past few minutes, some of the people that have featured on this show already have such incredible stories. If you have any questions for Paul, 0800 111 4041, give us a call. We're going to continue on with this conversation here on the show. Here on BBC Essex is Akila Rodriguez. I'm back with you after a week off, and we are talking to Paul Mullery, who hosts the X Job Downloaded podcast, where you interview those who are living post-service, majority within Essex Police, but you've also mentioned armed forces as well.
Yeah, sorry, all over the world. I've had people in Canada, Australia. That was a massive faux pas by me in Australia, though.
What do you mean?
Well, because I was interviewing this lady in Melbourne, and because there's a time difference. And what I don't do is I don't Google people before I interview them, so I don't get any preconceived ideas.
Okay.
And some of that comes from being in the police service, because actually I interviewed a number of murderers over the time, and people suspected of such. So you had to work on the hoof sometimes. And I was interviewing this lady, and I said, have you been to London before? And she said, yeah, I've been to London. Oh, okay. She said, yeah, I played cricket at Lord's, and she was a member of the Australian cricket team. But she'd been in the police in Australia and been in the army. And because I hadn't
Googled her.
If I'd have Googled her, I'd have found out.
So how do you find people to talk to if you haven't researched them online?
Well, what happens is I'll publish a podcast, and then somebody through LinkedIn or one of the other platforms, they might like it, and I just look at the bare bones, and it will say former police officer, military, whatever, and I get from there. So, and I've had absolute stunning people. I've had the man that carried the radio at the 1966 World Cup final, because they didn't have a radio system in the stadium, and he carried it in a backpack.
Wow.
Honestly, but these people are great, and everybody in the police and military has got a story. And the other thing they've got is the ability to tell the story. But they keep it all under a bushel. They don't share very freely. So I have to convince some people, because they're very private. I've got some great friends that I'd love to interview, but they just won't sit down with me. But I'd be quite happy to interview them and give them their card, their SD card, so that they've got them for their families.
I mean, Paul, you yourself, you've had, 30 years serving in Essex Police. You must have met, such a cross-section of different people. And I just wondered what aspects of your 3 decades in the force kind of spill over into your podcast the most, do you think?
I like to think my enthusiasm. I never lost my enthusiasm in the police service. Yeah, we had down days. Of course you did, because you tell me a job where you don't have bad days. But I've always maintained that, and my community love is always there. I believe that people should have a voice, and I believe that if I can give them that opportunity to share their views or tell their story, then that's what I do.
And you must have a fair few stories yourself.
I have. One day I will sit down and get them down. I've interviewed a number of influential, and I've met some very, very. I gave a police hat to George Benson at the Chelmsford Spectacular.
Wow.
Yeah, because my boss thought he was. I was the youngest detective in the office. My boss thought, we'll put him over there at Chelmsford Spectacular. Take that, Montserrat Caballé and George Benson. And I said to my boss that was there one day, I'm going to meet George Benson. He said, not a chance. And I met him, and he said, had photographed the whole lot. And I said, he said, I like those bobby hats. And I went back to the police station, and I grabbed a bobby hat, police hat, and I gave it to George Benson, because then I get called up by the chief superintendent on a Monday, but as it happens, the chief constable of the day was quite pleased, because it put us in a positive light. But yeah, so I've met some Princess Anne, I've met some amazing people, but it's the ordinary people that float my boat. It's the ordinary person that actually has done some amazing things. Simon Maloney, Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, the last person in Afghanistan to win that, shot through the throat, through the neck by a Taliban fighter. He got back on the roof of the building that he was defending and fought back, and he did the job that he was out there to do. I mean, these people are amazing. Don Shepherd, 104 years old, lives down at Basildon. I cried my eyes out when he read the dedication, because these are amazing people, but we need to get their stories encapsulated in a format that will be preserved forever, because in 100 years' time, we're not going to be here. Someone else will be living in our houses, whatever it'll be, someone totally disconnected. But when they Google these great people, hopefully I will have played a part to their history being preserved.
Do you notice any differences between those who you speak to post-serving in the military versus the police?
I think that with the military, they are more conditioned when they leave the military because they are given greater opportunity. Police service, you do your 30 years, you're patted on the back and you walk out the door, and that's where it ends. With the military, they do resettlement courses and whatever. But what I have noticed is there is more mental health within the military than there is within the police service. There is mental health, but PTSD, can you imagine going to war, going to conflict, and not, you just can't be, there's no way you can't be scarred. Gary Hayes is another local resident. He ran the mortuary for the 7/7 bombings. Never overcome that, the mental health, the PTSD that he goes through. But I think it's quite cathartic for my contributors to sit down and have somebody who's interested in their stories and deliver, or give them the opportunity to deliver their stories in a very direct way. It's so much fun. I don't make any money out of it, but there's and it's not about that. There's people in 94 countries that listen to this, and I get so excited when I click on the map and I can see that another country's been added, because this is something that started as a dream, and now it's gaining momentum. And yeah, of course we do it for likes, because we want people to listen and we want it to succeed. But I don't care if nobody listens to one of the episodes. I don't care, because if that person has the good grace to give me their time, then I will produce their story and let them get their story out there into the public domain.
Paul, you clearly have a lot of passion for what you do. I do have a couple more questions, so do stick around with us. Of course, if you've got any questions for Paul, 0800 111 4041. But I can feel your passion here in the studio for what you do, and I'm glad that you found this during your time as post-service as well. Where we're joined by former officer Paul Mulleary, who hosts the Ex-Job Downloaded podcast, where he speaks to guests about serving and life post-serving in the military and the police across the world. And it sounds like you've spoken to and heard some incredible stories, Paul. You're clearly very passionate about getting these stories saved and told and preserved.
Indeed.
Who's the one person you would like to interview that you haven't yet?
I would like to interview James Blunt, because James Blunt, now it's a strange one, but he is a very charismatic character. I would like to interview some of the royals, but James Blunt was an officer in the cavalry. And that's where the connection is, because I just think he's got a great story to tell. He was in the regiment when there's some terrible losses. I mean, you can't imagine the amount of people that have been killed and how that impacts on the soldiers. So I'd like to interview him. The guy that won the I think it's Britain's Got Talent, the magician. He's agreed to do a podcast with. So. Yeah, I think James Blunt. I'd like to have the opportunity to interview him.
James Blunt is not who I expected to come out.
Who did you think I was going to say?
I don't know, but to me, it was part of his thing when he came out that he used to be part of the armed forces, and now he's a pop star.
Yeah,
and a very funny guy as well.
He's a very funny guy, and I think he's a good raconteur. I think he tells some great stories. There are so many good people. Listen, if there's anybody out there that wants to take part in this, just email me, just tell me, and I will quite happily interview you. Colchester, we've got some brilliant people all over the county. Just get in touch with me and I'll quite happily come down and interview you.
There we go, the Ex-Job Downloaded podcast by former officer Paul Mulleary, who's been joining us on the show today. I mean, 30 years experience yourself, so you definitely know what questions to ask. And eventually we'll hear your story, perhaps hopefully, on the podcast. If you could go back and do it all again, would you?
Oh, in a heartbeat. I think that's a line from a Gladys Knight song. If we had the chance to do it all again, would we? Well, yeah, I would actually. I love the police. My dad was a soldier, served overseas, and yeah, I'd go back to the police. Not under the conditions they're in at the moment, But yeah, it's a great job, and anybody who wants to join, I would encourage them.
Well, there we go. Thank you very much, Paul, for joining us on the show today and sharing your podcast with us as well. We enjoy championing and celebrating local talent and things going on across Essex that do such incredible things like this as well. So thank you, Paul, for being a part of it. And of course, if you have created a podcast or something magical that you'd like to share with us, we'd love to chat with you too. 0800 111 40 41. And do not forget to listen to our show Upload as well. That is the show where you can put forward your creative talents as well. So Paul, maybe you could be on there too as well.
Love to.
I'll pop you in touch with our Rob Jelly. Thanks ever so much for joining us.